A flight attendant threatened a black family with a pen, but the father calmly turned the situation around, and the airline faced consequences no one expected. He jammed a pen into a baby's neck, thinking no one would dare intervene. He didn't know the father held the authority to turn that moment into instant reckoning. Subscribe if you believe cruelty always meets unstoppable consequences. The overhead bin slammed shut with a final metallic thud, and the hum of pre-flight announcements buzzed softly through the cabin. Darian Crestmore didn't flinch. Nate 3A gave him just enough space to cradle his infant son, Lior, who lay tucked beneath a soft gray blanket, breathing steadily against his chest. The child's warmth anchored Darian's thoughts, keeping him tethered after the stormy month he had just survived. Corporate restructuring had drained him, both as a leader and a father, but this flight was meant to be stillness, or so he hoped. Footsteps echoed down the aisle with clipped impatience. Darian glanced up. A flight attendant approached, tall, lean, and taut with tension. His name tag read Merrick Voss, and his face already wore the weariness of someone losing patience with the day before it had even truly begun. The tension in his gait wasn't just physical, it was targeted. Each step down the aisle came with a glance of disdain for anyone who dared look up, and a particular scowl whenever a baby whimpered or cried. Darian caught the flicker of Merrick's eyes as they locked on Lior, narrowing for half a second before continuing the patrol. Subtle, but revealing Darian didn't move, didn't react. That was his training. In boardrooms, in hostile acquisitions, in federal hearings, he had learned the power of stillness, but that stillness was not passivity. Behind his calm, his eyes cataloged every gesture, every tension in Merrick's posture, every unnecessary sigh as the attendant checked seatbelt latches with more force than needed. When Merrick passed by again and stopped just beside 3A, the silence took on a different tone. "Make sure he's secure," Merrick muttered without making eye contact, gesturing vaguely toward Lior. Not a request, a warning. "He is," Darian replied, voice calm, steady, but lined with a subtle edge. His arms tightened slightly around his son, who stirred but did not wake. Merrick didn't respond. Instead, his fingers tapped the metal pen clipped to his chest pocket. It was not the absent-minded rhythm of a man thinking. It was more deliberate, like someone preparing for a task. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was sharper than it should have been. Darian noted it, the edge of the pen glinting briefly in the overhead light. The tip seemed different, longer, narrower, almost too sharp to be standard issue. Modified? Possibly filed down. He filed the thought away. A low murmur of boarding noises continued as passengers settled, but Darian felt something shift. Merrick lingered for a breath too long, his gaze flicking again to Lior, unreadable. Then, without another word, he moved on. Passengers nearby exchanged brief, silent glances. Recognizing tension but unwilling to intervene, Darian had seen it before. The crowd always sensed when something was off, but rarely acted until it was too late. Darian turned his head slightly, watching Merrick return toward the galley. He reached for the black notebook tucked into the side of his bag, a leather-bound journal he called Operational Integrity. The name was no accident. It wasn't just a habit. It was a record, a log of every system weakness he encountered, especially in his own companies. Veyron Air was his. Most didn't know it, but he owned the controlling interest, and he chose to fly anonymously, to see the cracks from the inside. He opened the notebook and quietly began to write. 3A, Flight 716, Attendant, Merrick Voss. Displayed agitation upon boarding, multiple instances of visual hostility toward infants. Pen appears non-standard, tone to passengers bordering on aggressive watch for further escalation. He paused, then underlined one word. Escalation. The engines rumbled beneath them as the plane pushed back from the gate. A tremor of turbulence passed through the fuselage, and Lior's hand twitched against Darian's shirt collar. The child's grip was impossibly small, but sure, Darian smiled faintly. Then Merrick's voice cut over the intercom. Flat, fast, clipped. Not the soothing welcome passengers expected. Just instructions, rules, and a reminder to keep all disruptions to a minimum. The last word hung in the air too long. Darian caught a soft comment as Merrick passed again. A muttered remark, barely audible. "Can't stand all these crying parasites." It wasn't clear if it was meant to be overheard, but Darian heard it, and that was enough. His hand rested gently on Lior's back. His other turned a page in the notebook. A new entry began. The engines roared louder now. Flight 716 tilted forward and surged down the runway. Darian's gaze never left the aisle ahead. He saw Merrick vanish into the galley once more, shoulders tense, the pen still clipped to his chest like a silent threat. Darian leaned down slightly, his lips close to Lior's tiny ear. The baby made a soft, cooing sound, unaware of the storm forming around him, and with a voice made of steel wrapped in silk, Darian whispered, "We stay alert, always." Merrick Voss stopped mid-aisle, his frame rigid under the flickering cabin lights, and snapped his gaze to row 3A. The low hum of the aircraft did little to soften the tension in the air. "Sir," he said sharply, his voice slicing through the silence, "you need to control the noise." Darian Crestmore didn't flinch. Seated with one arm wrapped securely around his infant son, Lior, he looked up with the calm of a man used to being underestimated. Lior's soft whimpering was barely louder than the engine's drone, but Merrick's tone carried a weight that made nearby passengers glance over Darian, tilted his head slightly, and gave a polite nod. "Of course, I was just about to walk him toward the rear. It helps him settle." "No," Merrick interrupted, stepping forward. "Passengers are to remain seated. We're mid-flight." Darian's expression remained still, but behind his eyes 1,000 calculations fired. The tone, the stance, the aggression. It wasn't protocol. It was personal. Merrick's eyes flickered down to the child, narrowing, and that's when Darian saw it again. The pen clipped neatly to Merrick's apron was the same pen he'd noticed earlier. Not plastic, not company-issued, metal, heavy, two-pointed. The kind someone had either customized or sharpened for reasons that had nothing to do with writing. Merrick's fingers curled around it now, almost absently, his thumb pressing the clicker with repeated snaps, each one sounding louder than the last. Click, click, click. Darian glanced at the people around him. A man in 4B was already angling his phone, recording under the tray table. A younger guy across the aisle froze with his earbuds out, watching with alert, quiet concern. Even still, no one intervened. The illusion of safety was too strong, and Merrick wore the uniform of authority. "I'm simply trying to help him calm down," Darian said evenly, adjusting Lior's blanket. "I'm not requesting to stand for long." "You're not standing at all," Merrick said, his voice dropping low. "Rules are rules. You want calm? Try silence." Darian locked eyes with him. "Step back, please." For a brief second, Merrick didn't move. Then, with an exaggerated shrug, he leaned closer, far too close to Lior's face, his shadow draping across the infant like a storm cloud. Lior squirmed, letting out a gentle cry, more confused than distressed, but it was enough. Merrick's smirk curled like a trigger being pulled. He lifted his notepad, pretended to scribble, then held it up. Blank. Nothing written, just performance. "Is this your way of establishing control?" Darian asked, voice calm but harder now, edged with steel. "Just documenting the disturbance," Merrick replied. "Babies like yours, they ruin premium cabins." Darian's muscles tightened, his breath controlled, a technique he'd mastered during years of high-stakes negotiations and boardroom wars. But this was different. This was his son. And Merrick had crossed an invisible threshold, one not marked in any training manual, but deeply etched in the instincts of a father. He felt Lior's small hand press against his chest, the motion grounding him, pulling him back from the urge to respond emotionally. Instead, Darian studied Merrick's movements, the twitch in his jaw, the controlled grip around the pen, the way his eyes kept darting from Lior to the other passengers, as if measuring the boundaries of what he could get away with. The tension wasn't just thick, it was tangible, something building in the space between them, unspoken but felt by everyone nearby. "I'll repeat this once," Darian said, his voice barely above a whisper but heavy with authority. "Step back. Now." Merrick hesitated again. His breathing had quickened slightly. Then, without responding, he leaned in just an inch further and clicked the pen once more, the sound sharp like a blade being unsheathed. Across the cabin, several phones were now up, not just filming, but live streaming. A passenger in 2C shifted nervously, pulling his child a bit closer. The woman beside him mouthed something, then turned back toward the confrontation, unable to look away. Darian didn't blink. His mind was already working through next steps. His internal dialogue was clear and concise. "You're not in a boardroom, you're in a pressure chamber. But pressure is where clarity forms. Stay calm. Let him bury himself." And yet, the moment remained suspended in glass. Lior let out another soft cry. It was the sound that snapped something in Merrick. His eyes darkened. His lips curled. He muttered again, this time under his breath, the words just loud enough for Darian to catch. "Noisy babies don't belong up here." Darian inhaled slowly through his nose, his fingers brushing gently across Lior's back, and felt the baby's trembling. His heartbeat slowed on purpose, his body trained over years to absorb the storm before redirecting it. And still, no response came from the cabin crew, no voice of moderation. Only silence and the weight of 100 gazes. Merrick stepped back an inch but didn't leave. He tapped the pen once more against the edge of the service tray, the sound like a clock winding down before it stops completely. Darian glanced at the others again, eyes wide, some afraid, some enraged, all frozen. The moment was no longer private, it was public, documented, irrevocable. And yet the scene held, stretching, tightening, ready to snap inside his mind. Darian repeated what he had always taught his staff during high-pressure simulations. Read the fault line. Anticipate the fracture. Move just before the break. He could feel it now, that fracture. Not in the plane, in Merrick. And so he whispered to himself, as much for Lior as for what was about to come. The moment before the unthinkable always feels strangely calm. The moment begins with violence. Fast, sharp, and unexpected. Merrick steps forward with a suddenness that startles everyone within reach, the overhead lights catching the thin, metallic glint of the pen clenched in his hand. His other hand slams against Darian's shoulder, forcing him back into the narrow seat cushions. The impact makes the seatbelt buckle rattle, a harsh metallic sound swallowed by the collective gasp that sweeps through the cabin. Darian tightens his grip on Lior instinctively, twisting his body to shield the infant. But the cramped space leaves him nowhere to move, no room to fully protect the child he is desperate to keep safe. Passengers freeze in shock. A man in 5A fumbles with his phone before finally lifting it to record, while another near the aisle reaches frantically for the call button. Merrick, however, appears detached from the rising panic around him. His eyes burn with an anger that has long been simmering beneath the surface, and now it erupts without restraint. "Hold still," he snaps, his voice trembling with misplaced authority, though his words sound irrational even to those who hear them. Darian leans as far away as the seat allows, his breathing controlled but tightening, each inhale sharpened by fear for his son. He whispers, "Step back," but Merrick ignores him, leaning in closer instead. Lior's soft whimper builds into a distressed cry, the kind that pierces through every layer of noise. The infant's tiny fists curl, trembling against Darian's chest. For a split second, Darian sees Merrick's grip firm on the pen, his knuckles whitening. The same pen he had noticed earlier, its tip unnaturally sharp, its purpose unclear but unsettling. There is no warning, no hesitation, only a single, horrifying movement. Merrick drives the pen forward, stabbing it into the side of Lior's neck. The sharp point pierces the fragile skin just below the ear, a place so delicate that the pen sinks in almost too easily. The sound that follows, the infant's scream, is high, raw, and filled with pain too intense for a child who has barely begun to understand the world. Darian's entire body jerks, a silent cry trapped in his throat as he feels the shock, the warm, horrifying rush of blood against his hand. Chaos erupts instantly. A man in 4A shouts for help, his voice cracking. Another passenger shouts, "He stabbed the baby!" Others press themselves against the windows, desperate for space, while several phones rise to capture the scene because they know, instinctively, that no one will ever believe this without proof. Merrick steps back, breathing heavily, as if he has just completed something justified. "I was checking for choking hazards," he blurts out, his tone defensive yet strangely detached. His explanation makes no sense, and passengers recoil in disbelief. Darian looks up at him slowly, an expression forming that is not rage, but something far deeper and colder. Silent fury settles behind his eyes, controlled but dangerous. He forces his trembling hands to steady as he supports Lior's head. Blood drips in thin lines down the child's neck, staining Darian's fingers. But he does not panic. His mind shifts into precise, practiced assessment, instincts sharpened from years of studying the very emergency procedures he once implemented for this airline. "Stay with me," he murmurs to Lior, though his own voice nearly breaks. The pen remains lodged for a moment before Darian gently grips it and pulls it out with careful, deliberate movement. Every millimeter removed feels like a knife twisting through his own heart. Lior cries harder, his body shaking against Darian's chest. With swift accuracy, Darian reaches into his bag and retrieves a sanitized cloth, something he always carries, not out of fear, but habit, preparation ingrained into his life. He presses it gently against the wound, creating pressure without causing further harm. The cloth begins to redden almost immediately. Around him, the cabin blurs into noise, people shouting, some crying, others frozen. But Darian hears only his son's cry, the fragile sound that has always anchored him. His breathing deepens, not from fear, but from focus, an internal shift from passenger to protector. Merrick stands a few feet away now, trembling, realizing, far too late, that he has crossed a line that cannot be undone. His lips part as if to speak, but no words form. Darian does not look at him again. His attention remains on Lior, his touch steady even as his heart breaks. He lifts his son closer, brushing a thumb gently across the tiny cheek soaked in tears. His voice softens into something both strong and full of quiet promise. "I've got you, I promise. I've got you, I promise." The cabin was no longer quiet as Darian rose from his seat, cradling the wounded infant in his left arm and gripping the blood-stained pen in his right. The sterile hum of the aircraft gave way to gasps, rising voices, and the unmistakable stir of panic. Lior whimpered softly, his small frame tucked against Darian's chest, the side of his neck slick with blood. Darian's eyes didn't flicker with fear. They burned, not with rage, but with focused, surgical intent. Every second mattered now. "Medical kit. Now." His voice sliced through the chaos with chilling precision. The nearest flight attendant, a young man named Jalen Crest, hesitated only a fraction of a moment before scrambling down the aisle toward the forward compartment passengers, who had moments ago been passive spectators, now leaned into the aisles, some with phones raised, others frozen in stunned silence. The entire cabin seemed to pivot on a single axis. Darian. Merrick Voss stood a few feet away, chest heaving, sweat gathering along his temple. His eyes darted between Darian and the passengers, restraining him with their presence alone. For the first time, doubt crawled across his face. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but Darian didn't look at him. His attention was fully on his son. Lior's breathing was shallow, but steady. The cloth Darian had wrapped around his neck was soaked through at the edge. Still, the wound appeared not to have severed anything critical. No arterial spray, no rapid pulse loss. But Darian knew better than to guess. He needed confirmation, professional assessment, stabilization. "Clear a path to the front," Darian said, not raising his voice but commanding with unmistakable force. Jalen returned with the kit, his hand shaking as he extended it forward. I didn't know it was this bad," he whispered, glancing at the pen, then at Lior, and finally at Darian. "You knew enough," Darian replied, his voice cold but even. He stepped toward the front, motioning for Jalen to follow. As they approached the cockpit door, Darian's presence parted the cabin like a blade through silk. No one questioned him. No one obstructed him. "Open the intercom," he ordered. Jalen hesitated. "Sir, we're not—" "Now." Jalen keyed the panel. "This is Crestmore." Darian spoke into the microphone with the force of years spent leading crisis rooms, financial audits, and emergency briefings. "There's been an assault on board. An infant has been attacked. Immediate emergency landing is required. Priority clearance. Alert the field." A beat of silence. Then the cockpit door cracked open. Captain Torrin Vale stepped out, face pale, jaw clenched. He had only met Darian once during a surprise audit 2 years ago, but he remembered the eyes. The quiet, deliberate way Darian walked a room, the way silence seemed to follow his footsteps. "Understood, Mr. Crestmore. We're diverting to Rivum Field 23 minutes out. I'll notify ATC." Darian gave a tight nod. "Do it." Behind them, Merrick tried to edge toward the galley, but 2 passengers moved before he could take a second step. One, a tall man from row 4A, placed a hand squarely on his shoulder. "Don't," he said simply. Merrick froze. Jalen, pale and visibly shaking, watched as Darian turned his attention toward the jump seat, eyes briefly locking on the laminated flight manual clipped beside it. The page titled Passenger Interaction. Emergency use of force was partially visible, an addendum Darian himself had overseen during a silent revision of airline policy 2 years prior. He knew every clause, every legal threshold, every penalty, and Merrick had just crossed them all. Darian seated himself on the jump seat, clutching Lior close. The child stirred, letting out a small, pained sound that cracked like glass in the silence. Jalen dropped to one knee beside him, medical kit open, fumbling for antiseptic and gauze. I didn't know he'd actually," Jalen stammered. "Just help me stop the bleeding," Darian said, his eyes never leaving Lior's face. "We'll deal with everything else after." Cameras continued recording. Passengers whispered. The story was already halfway across the internet. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a medical emergency, we are making an unscheduled landing at Rivum Field. Please remain seated and calm. We'll be on the ground shortly." The aircraft began its slow descent. Merrick Voss slumped against the side of the galley wall, his face pale, lips trembling. "It was an accident. He was making noise. I thought he was—" "Quiet," one of the passengers muttered beside him. Darian didn't rise. He simply pressed the gauze tighter, adjusting Lior's head gently. His thumb brushed over the baby's cheek with incredible care. There was no panic, only clarity. The pen, still slick with blood, sat beside him on a folded napkin. It looked small, insignificant, but it wasn't. It was a weapon now. Evidence. And it would become something more in the hours ahead. Merrick swallowed, suddenly aware that no one was on his side. Not the crew, not the passengers, not the cameras, not the law, and certainly not the man who now spoke. barely above a whisper but with enough weight to silence an entire world. "You assaulted the wrong child." The plane hit a sudden drop as it began its rapid descent toward Rivum Field, and the entire cabin jolted with a force that made passengers gasp and tighten their grips on armrests. Darien steadied himself instantly, acting on instinct, pulling Lior closer as he stood from his seat and moved toward the forward jump seat. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, even though his heartbeat hammered with a protective fear he refused to show. The infant whimpered softly against his chest, the faint sound cutting through the thick tension like a thread of pain. Jalen, hands trembling as he hovered nearby, kept glancing between the baby's bandaged neck and Darien's calm but sharpened expression. He whispered, "His breathing is still steady, sir. But the bleeding—" His voice cracked, betraying the panic he fought to suppress. "I see it," Darien murmured, easing into the jump seat and securing the straps one-handed. His voice was low, steady enough to anchor Jalen's nerves even as the aircraft rattled under the strain of its descent. Lior's tiny fingers clutched at Darien's shirt, gripping with instinctive desperation, and Darien lowered his chin for a moment to kiss the child's forehead, an act that quieted the infant's cries and drew silent awe from the watching passengers. Across the aisle, Merrick sat restrained with makeshift belt straps pulled tight across his chest and arms. Two passengers, broad-shouldered men with stern expressions, held him firmly in place each time he tried to shift. Merrick kept repeating the same line, louder each time. "It was an accident. I was trying to check the child's condition." But his voice wavered, and sweat had gathered along his brow, revealing fear he couldn't hide. Darien heard every word, though he didn't look at Merrick yet. He didn't need to. He had already begun, silently and efficiently, assembling every piece of the legal case in his mind, every motion, every word, every witness angle. Nothing would be missed. The cockpit door opened briefly, and Captain Torrin Vale stepped into view. His face was drawn tight with worry as he met Darien's eyes. Those eyes that carried authority Torrin recognized from the last time they had crossed paths in a hidden corporate audit. "We're landing now," Torrin said, voice low and certain. "Medical and security teams are already on standby." "Good," Darien replied. His tone held an unspoken message, and Torrin nodded once before retreating to the cockpit. He didn't need further instruction. He knew this incident would go beyond protocol, beyond routine discipline. It would reach the very core of the company. A tremor of turbulence shook the aircraft again, causing passengers to gasp and murmur. Phones remained raised, capturing every angle of Merrick, of Darien, of the wounded infant whose soft breaths filled the silence between jolts. The recordings were already uploading, already spreading, already creating the trail that no one could erase. Darien reached into his coat with his free hand, pulling out his travel notebook. He flipped it open to the blank page he had noticed earlier, a simple, empty rectangle of paper, quiet, harmless, almost forgettable. Yet in Darien's mind, the page had already changed. It had become a place where history would shift, where a decision would take form that no executive, no director, no corrupt system could undo. He rested the pen across the edge of the notebook, letting it sit there like a promise waiting to be signed. Foreshadowing rippled quietly through the moment. The blank page, the waiting pen, the silent decision forming in Darien's eyes. The wheels slammed against the runway in a hard landing that jerked the cabin sharply forward. Oxygen masks swung slightly from their compartments, and several passengers yelped in fright. But Darien held Lior steady, shielding him with both arms as the aircraft screeched to a halt. He didn't flinch. His entire focus was on the fragile life he protected. When the plane stopped completely, the emergency slides remained unused, but the doors were opened within seconds. The sharp scent of jet fuel mixed with fresh air as paramedics climbed aboard, rushing past seated passengers with urgent steps. Jalen stepped aside quickly, waving them toward Darien. "Here, he's here," he said, pointing at the infant. One paramedic knelt beside Darien, examining Lior's injury with careful hands. "His pulse is stable," the man murmured, but his eyes widened when he realized the depth of the wound. "We need to move fast." Behind them, Merrick tried one final plea, his voice cracking. "Sir, please, listen. I didn't mean to—" Darian raised a single hand without turning around. The gesture was small, quiet, yet it silenced Merrick instantly. Even the passengers fell still, watching the scene unfold with held breath as the paramedics prepared Lior for immediate treatment. Darian finally stood, shifting the baby into their care with a tenderness that struck every witness deeply. He turned calmly toward Merrick, his eyes cold with truth, his voice soft but unwavering. "You didn't just break protocol," Darian said, stepping closer, letting the restrained attendant feel the weight of every word. "You broke the future of your own company." "You broke the future of your own company?" The wheels hadn't stopped spinning when the emergency door swung open. Two paramedics climbed the air stairs in rapid, trained succession as passengers pressed to one side of the fuselage to let them pass. The cabin buzzed with whispered panic and held back emotion, phones still filming, eyes still locked on the aisle where it had all unraveled. Darian Crestmore descended the steps slowly, one hand securing the base of his son's head, while the other kept Lior's body close against his chest. The infant's face was pale but conscious, his tiny fingers twitching against the folds of Darian's suit. Flashbulbs erupted from nearby gates, voices rising in confused fragments. "Is that the baby? He's holding something in his hand. What is that, a pen? That's the dad. He never even shouted." On the tarmac, two uniformed officers flanked Merrick Voss in handcuffs, his face damp with sweat, mouth still moving in low, frantic protests that no one took seriously. The passengers stepping off behind him didn't even glance his way. Their eyes were drawn to the man in the dark navy blazer, walking with controlled urgency and carrying a wounded child as if the whole weight of the airline depended on the way he moved. It did. Paramedic Ren Jorel met him halfway, a kit in one hand and a flashlight in the other. "Sir, please, let me take a look at the injury," he said, already lifting the bandage Darian had applied in flight. Darian nodded, his grip loosening just enough for the medic to examine the damage beneath. A clean puncture, shallow but close to a nerve cluster, Ren's expression settled into cautious relief. "It's not life-threatening," he confirmed. "Painful, yes. There's swelling, but no arterial damage. We'll clean it again and monitor for fever. He's lucky." "No," Darian replied softly, watching Lior's face. "He's resilient." The moment should have brought visible relief, but Darian's posture remained taut, shoulders square, jaw locked, his gaze scanning every face on the runway like he was still in enemy territory. Captain Torrin Vale approached with his pilot's logbook tucked under one arm, his cap in hand. "Mr. Sir, Darian, The seasoned captain struggled for words. "I can't begin to express—" "You're not the one responsible," Darian cut in, his voice quiet but heavy. "The problem began long before you boarded that cockpit." Torrin nodded once, shame carved deep into his features. "If you need anything." "I need a room, quiet, and a door that locks." The request was calm, but it landed like a command. One of the terminal supervisors overheard and blinked. "Sir, only security or executives can authorize." Darian raised an eyebrow. "I'll get you the key," the man said immediately. Inside the terminal, behind a reinforced door labeled Private Ops, Internal Use Only, the noise of the airport faded. The fluorescent lights hummed above a long rectangular table. A few framed airline safety accolades hung crookedly on the wall. A single surveillance monitor blinked in the corner. Its feed paused on a grainy image of the plane's door opening. Darian laid Lior across his chest, patting the baby's back in slow, measured rhythms. He unclipped a travel pouch from his side and removed the blood-stained pen, placing it precisely in the center of the table. It glinted under the light, no longer a writing tool, but evidence. The door opened again. Jalen Crest stepped in, pale and breathless. He'd changed out of his uniform jacket, but his ID tag still swung slightly as he moved. "I had to see you," he said quietly. "No one else knows you're in here yet, but they're asking questions." Darian didn't respond. He watched the pen. "I should have warned you," Jalen continued, voice trembling now. "I've seen Merrick lose it before. Not like this, but close. There were complaints, 4, maybe 5 from different crew, about aggression, instability. I even submitted one myself." "Where are the records?" Jalen hesitated. "Gone. All of them. Just vanished from the logbook. Even HR said they couldn't find the system entries." "So someone scrubbed them." Darian looked up at him. "Intentionally?" Jalen nodded. I think someone's been protecting him. Higher up. He knew it too. That's why he got worse. He thought he was untouchable." Darian opened his leather-bound notebook and turned to the first blank page. He didn't write anything. Not yet. His fingers hovered above it like the moment before striking a match. "The system didn't just fail today," he said. "It rotted slowly, quietly, and no one lit the alarm." Lior stirred, a tiny breath catching in his throat, and Darian instinctively repositioned him, tucking the edge of his jacket over the child's shoulder. The room felt like it had dropped 10 degrees, and not from the air conditioning. "What are you going to do?" Jalen asked. "I'm going to find out who let this happen," Darian said, "and then I'm going to burn the roots of it." He tapped the notebook once, an old habit, a signal to himself that something was about to begin. Jalen shifted his weight. "Are you going public?" Darian didn't answer. He stood slowly, one hand resting on the back of a chair, the other gently cupping the side of his son's head. Then he looked down at the pen again. It still smelled like ink. And something else beneath it. Sterile metal touched by blood. "I designed this company to protect people," he said. "Today, it attacked a child. My child." He closed the notebook and stared at the doorway, as if already seeing beyond it, past the terminal, past the cameras, past the fragile systems that had let corruption thrive. This isn't just about the assault, it's about what allowed it. The first officer stepped through the door without knocking. Behind him came 2 others, uniforms crisp, eyes alert, and at their center stood Director Helron Vass, a man whose name carried weight in aviation enforcement circles. His reputation preceded him, methodical, incorruptible, unshakable. The room's sterile lighting did little to soften the atmosphere as the door shut behind them with a quiet but definitive click. Helron glanced at the blood-stained pen resting on the table, then at the infant nestled against Darian Crestmore's chest. Lior slept, breathing in tiny, even pulses, a bandage around his neck the only visible reminder of the horror from the flight. Darian didn't rise. He didn't need to. His posture, relaxed, centered, unyielding, radiated authority even though his suit jacket bore dried stains and his left arm encircled a child. "We understand you requested this meeting," Helron said, voice clipped, professional. "Before we proceed, we want to clarify. Any statement made here may be included in the federal record." Darian nodded once, understood. Helron signaled to one of the officers who set a recorder on the table and pressed the button. A red light blinked to life. "State your full name for the record." "Darian Crestmore." Helron blinked, recognition just on the edge of surfacing, but the name hadn't yet landed. He continued, "And your relationship to the infant." Darian gently stroked Lior's back. "He is my son." Helron nodded. "Do you wish to file charges against the individual known as Merrick Voss?" Darian's voice came without hesitation. "Charges are mandatory. This wasn't a personal dispute. It was a deliberate act of violence against a defenseless passenger." The officers exchanged glances, surprised by the firmness. One scribbled notes faster. Helron leaned forward slightly, the shift subtle but revealing a crack in his neutral posture. "There may be company-level remedies," he offered, "including compensation or administrative," Darian cut in. voice still calm but edged with frost. "You're still assuming I'm here as a victim, asking for restitution from the company." A pause. It lingered. The air shifted. As if gravity subtly increased, Helron cleared his throat. "You're not?" Darian's reply was almost gentle. "I am the company." The silence that followed was absolute. One of the officers dropped his pen. Helron sat back slowly, eyes narrowing as the puzzle rearranged itself in real time. "Crestmore," he echoed half to himself. "Darian Crestmore, Veyron Group. Primary owner, I established the internal emergency ethics protocols, including the clause that mandates immediate executive review in the case of passenger harm by crew." The red recording light blinked steadily between them like a metronome of unraveling power dynamics. Jalen Crest, who had been standing silently near the corner, took a step forward, his voice hesitant. "They didn't know, sir. I should have informed them sooner, but I didn't want to breach protocol without your go-ahead." Darian gave him a single nod of approval. "You did right, Jalen." Helron adjusted his collar. "I apologize for the tone of our entry. Had we known—" "I prefer you didn't," Darian said, cutting him off with surgical precision. "It revealed how protocol functions under assumed power. That's useful." Lior stirred slightly, a whimper rising in his sleep. Darian gently rocked him, and the baby settled again. The presence of the child, wounded yet safe, reminded the room why they were there. One of the junior officers, eyes still wide, cleared his throat. "There's something else. We pulled in-flight communication logs. Merrick Voss made a call during the flight." "To whom?" Darian asked, eyes narrowing. The officer opened his tablet and read aloud. "A direct line to Veyron Command Office, registered under internal access clearance. The note reads, 'Handling a disturbance in premium cabin situation controlled.'" Darian's hand tensed slightly on Lior's back. Someone on the ground cleared him, validated his aggression. Helron leaned forward, finally beginning to grasp the scale of the situation. That would suggest coordination, or, at the very least, complicit negligence. Darian opened his notebook and flipped to the final page. Instead of writing, he took out a pen, this one gold, unmarred, official, and drew a small circle at the top of the page. It was a gesture no one in the room understood, except Jalen, who stiffened at the sight. It was Darian's private signal, used only before making irreversible executive decisions. "I have reason to believe," Darian said slowly, "that the behavior displayed on that aircraft was not isolated. It was enabled, shielded, perhaps even encouraged by someone high enough to erase complaints, override logs, and train people like Merrick to believe they were untouchable." Helron's voice came low. "If that's the case, Mr. Crestmore, this might go beyond a criminal act. It could become a corporate failure of national consequence." Darian closed the notebook. "That's why you're here." The younger officer looked at Jalen and then back at Darian. "Sir, with respect, why didn't you tell anyone who you were when it all began?" Darian looked down at his sleeping son. His voice was quiet. "Because sometimes the only way to find rot is to walk through the halls without a crown. Today, it exposed itself." Helron picked up his pen again, but his hand trembled slightly this time. "Understood." Darian turned his gaze toward him, steady and final. "Now you understand why this can't be ignored." The image froze mid-frame Lior's neck, tiny and exposed, caught in a single cruel instant of stillness as the sharp tip of Merrick's pen made contact. Around the screen, the investigators stood motionless. No one breathed. The digital playback hung like a noose in the air, silent, damning, undeniable. Then, with a quiet click, Officer Wren resumed the footage. The sound of gasps and a child's cry spilled back into the room. Darian Crestmore didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his head slowly, eyes steady on the screen, his infant son now asleep in his arms beneath a clean bandage. The medical wrap gently cradled Lior's neck, But Darian's arm held more than comfort. It held memory, weight, purpose. "We need the name," he said. His voice, though calm, carried an authority that made the three investigators straighten. Officer Wren tapped a few keys on the terminal, his fingers unsteady. After a moment, he read from the log. "Supervisor Taryn Hale," he said. "In-flight staff oversight." Merrick called him mid-flight. Just a few minutes before that. Darian's jaw tightened. No words came, but the silence that followed said enough. He had suspected Taryn Hale for months. Subtle indicators, vanished reports, sudden transfers, internal whispers with no paper trail. Darian had no proof until now. This wasn't an accident. It was systemic. Leor stirred in his arms. The faint motion softened Darian's eyes momentarily. He adjusted his grip, whispering something inaudible to the child, something that seemed to anchor him in the middle of the storm. Now, gathering around them, Darian moved to the table where his black leather notebook sat unopened. He flipped it to a page, not a new one, but one from weeks earlier. On it were notes written in his clean, methodical hand. TH. Persistent pattern concealment. Monitor escalation rate. If 3+ disappearances equals formal internal probe. Foreshadowing in ink. He ran a finger under the circle he had drawn around the initials weeks ago. TH. There it was. The line from suspicion to confirmation had been drawn. All it took was a child's pain to reveal the truth. The lead investigator, Helren Vass, shifted awkwardly beside him, still clearly processing the shift in energy. "Mr. Crestmore," Darian cut in, not unkindly, but without hesitation. "I'll walk to headquarters myself." "But we can escort you," Wren offered, unsure whether it was a question or protocol. "I'm aware," Darian said, "but this time, the walk matters." And with that, he lifted Leor gently against his shoulder. The sleeping child sighing into the fabric of his shirt, Darian turned and opened the door, the investigators stepping aside like pieces on a board, repositioning themselves. Outside, the terminal pulsed with tension. Word had spread, somehow. It always did. Passengers still lingered near the gate, whispering, scrolling, watching him. Then it started. Slow applause. It began with a middle-aged man near the window, joined by a young father holding his own child, then an attendant with tears in his eyes. The claps weren't loud, but they built like a tide, quiet, respectful, full of something raw. Gratitude, shame, solidarity. Darian didn't acknowledge it with a wave or a smile. He simply kept walking, each step steady. Not toward praise, but toward the rot that hid behind polished logos and boardroom doors. Jalen Crest appeared beside him, falling into pace with nervous energy stitched into every breath. "Sir, the board, should I?" "Prepare them," Darian said without stopping. "For the protocol?" Jalen asked, voice shaking. "For the meeting," Darian replied, slowing just slightly as they reached a row of surveillance monitors. The central screen showed a replay of the cabin incident again, paused now on Merrick's face right after the strike. Not triumphant, not even angry, just blank. Darian stared at it. "You thought you could hide this," he whispered under his breath. "You thought no one would pull back the curtain." He looked to Jalen. "I want every report Merrick ever triggered, recovered, decrypted, and traced. I want to know who suppressed them, and I want the board ready tonight. No excuses, no delays." "Yes, Mr. Crestmore?" Darian nodded once. His voice dropped lower, no longer needing volume, just truth. "Tonight, the airline reforms, or it ends. Tonight, the airline reforms, or it ends." He laughed, convinced the act would remain hidden, unaware that every move was being calculated, and that the next signature would decide his fate. If you believe arrogance collapses the moment true power stands, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Darian pushed open the glass doors of the Veyron Air Command office, the weight of his son's carrier balanced in one hand and the blood-stained pen resting like cold iron in the other. The corridor ahead echoed with the frantic shuffle of dress shoes and hushed voices, the sound of a corporate empire scrambling to contain a fire. It didn't yet understand word had arrived before him, but not truth. That was Darian's to deliver. Down the hallway, doors swung open. Executives emerged from their offices, ties half-knotted, tablets glowing with partial reports, emergency threads lighting up their screens. No one approached him directly. They watched as he passed, as if sensing the gravity in his silence, the finality in his stride. Inside the boardroom, Supervisor Taryn Hale stood at the head of the long conference table, his pale face glistening with sweat. He looked like a man who'd rehearsed several versions of the truth but no version of an apology. He flinched when Darian entered. "Mr. Crestmore," Taryn began, forcing a professional tone, though his voice cracked. I just got the initial brief. I was told there was a disturbance involving one of the attendants. I assumed it was being handled." Darian didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped to the head of the table, set the baby carrier down carefully, and placed the blood-stained pen beside it, inkless, but now forever marked. Leor stirred faintly, his small hand brushing the blanket across his chest. Silence fell like a curtain. The other executives who had followed Darian into the room froze mid-step. The sight of the pen and the sleeping child said more than any report ever could. Taryn's expression twisted. Confusion, fear, calculation. "I had no idea it was that serious," he said quickly. "I was informed Merrick was managing an unruly passenger with a child. Why were the misconduct reports deleted?" Darian's voice was low-controlled, but each syllable carried weight like metal dropped into still water. Taryn blinked, visibly caught off guard. What do you mean?" "Every documented complaint against Merrick Voss gone. Vanished before review. System access logs show your clearance code was used." Taryn's mouth opened, but nothing came. Then, "System glitches? It happens sometimes. The logs." A new voice interrupted from farther down the table. "I can't let him lie anymore." Renner Vale stepped forward, head of personnel, eyes steady. "Darian, Taryn wasn't just negligent. He was bribed." Taryn spun toward him, jaw clenched. "That's not true." "Yes, it is." Renner's voice sharpened. "I've seen the payroll anomalies, the shadow bonuses. He's been working with a group we thought was just rumors, the Veyron Circle, a quiet protection ring inside staff operations. They cover for each other, erase files, bury complaints. Merrick was one of them." The room chilled. Foreshadowing that had once sat as suspicion in Darian's notebook now rang out as truth. Taryn's knees nearly buckled. "That group doesn't even exist. It's speculation." "You're lying to the wrong man," Darian said, stepping forward. His hand gently settled on Leor's carrier, grounding himself, controlling the tide. "I've spent the last year auditing patterns that didn't make sense. The vanished reports, the unexplainable promotions, the complaints that never escalated. And today, one of your protected men stabbed a child in the neck with a pen." "My child." Taryn opened his mouth again but could only stammer. I didn't know." "No," Darian said coldly. "You didn't care to know." He pulled his notebook from his coat and opened it to the last blank page. Executives leaned in unconsciously, breath held, as if they knew something irreversible was about to happen. Darian didn't speak right away. He looked down at his son, sleeping, peaceful, unaware that the tides of a corporation and its history were shifting around him. Then he raised his eyes, locked them on Taryn, and spoke with calm steel. "The airline shuts down until every rot is removed." The boardroom erupted. Voices rose in panic, fists slammed on mahogany, and executives leaned across the long table as if volume could reverse what they had just heard. But Darian Crestmore didn't flinch. He raised one hand, no louder than a breath, and silence fell as if a switch had been thrown. He stood at the head of the table, posture tall, a father and a reformer fused in the same body. His shirt bore a faint stain where Lior's bandaged neck had pressed moments earlier. In his left hand, he held the notebook. In his right, the same pen Merrick had jammed into his son. It glinted in the conference room light, steel, sharp, and soaked in implication. "We suspend all operations," Darien said. His voice was calm, but it carried the power of finality, effective immediately. A wave of protest surged. "You can't be serious," one executive blurted, rising halfway out of his seat. "A complete shutdown will destroy the brand, we'll lose billions in hours." "We're publicly traded," another added, frantically scrolling on his phone. "The markets will react in minutes. Do you want headlines calling us unstable?" Darien didn't move. His gaze swept the room, then narrowed. "Financial devastation," he said slowly, "can be rebuilt. A child's life cannot." Silence again. This time, heavier Taryn Hale slumped in his chair, sweat beating at his temples. His lips parted, but no words came out. His world was folding in on itself. Darien stepped closer to the center of the table. His footsteps were soft but deliberate, like the ticking of a countdown clock no one could stop. He reached the blank page of his notebook, one he had reserved for only the most catastrophic decisions, and placed it flat before him. "I designed a clause 5 years ago," he said, not looking up. "Most of you voted for it, thinking it would never be used. It was buried in page 72 of the Operational Integrity Charter." He lifted the pen. "The Emergency Executive Shutdown Clause." Gasps. A sharp intake of breath from Jalen. A muttered curse from someone near the back. Darien clicked the pen once. That sound, so small, seemed to echo. "This clause was meant for acts of catastrophic misconduct," Darien continued. "Not financial fraud, not poor service reviews, but something worse, something that undermines the very promise we make to every passenger, that they will be safe, that their children will be safe." He paused, letting the silence stretch like a blade across the room. "An employee drove this pen into my son's neck." He wrote the date on the page, each stroke clean, unhurried, as if it were a ceremony. No chain of command intervened, no red flag halted him, and when he radioed for cover, the response wasn't accountability, it was protection. He wrote the time, which means the rot goes deeper than one man. He signed his name. The stroke of the final letter felt like a thunderclap, even though no sound accompanied it. The signature was elegant, almost artistic, but to the men in that room, it was a wrecking ball. The room vibrated with disbelief. No one dared speak. Taryn Hale slowly turned pale, then green. His jaw moved, but the words never made it out. He looked like a man whose oxygen had been stolen. Darien turned his eyes to him. Not cruel, not gloating, just unwavering. "You're terminated," Darien said, "effective immediately. Your records are being frozen. Expect federal charges." Then, to Jalen, who stood still near the door, face pale but steady, Darien gave a single nod. "Notify every division. Begin public announcement protocol. Our systems go dark within the hour." Jalen swallowed and replied, "Yes, sir." In a corner, a junior executive slumped into a chair, whispering to himself, "This can't be happening." But it was, and Darien knew it had to. Lior, wrapped snug in a blanket, stirred softly in the carrier beside the table. His small frame rose and fell, unbothered by the storm his wound had unleashed. Darien glanced at him, then closed the notebook. "This signature ends the old Veyron Air." News cameras whirred as Darien Crestmore stepped into the glaring light of the Veyron command terminal. The world already knew. Within minutes of touchdown, every major outlet had run the headline. Major airline suspends all operations following infant assault. Crowds had begun gathering outside terminals across the country, unsure whether to rage or applaud. Inside Rivum's central corridor, chaos turned to stillness the moment Darien appeared. No longer anonymous, no longer just a well-dressed father in seat 3A, he was now unmistakably the man who halted an empire. Cradled against his chest was Lior, sleeping lightly despite the bandage around his neck. The mark of violence was still fresh. Every footstep Darien took echoed with quiet resolve, and the employees he passed, all men in polished uniforms and tailored suits, parted instinctively, unsure whether to salute or apologize. Tension crackled in the air. Men who once passed him without a glance now stood straight, jaws clenched, eyes downcast. Federal officers led Supervisor Taryn Hale through the opposite hallway in handcuffs, his pale face locked in a grimace of disbelief. The crowd surged to glimpse him. Murmurs turned into sharp curses. Some shouted, "Monster!" Others filmed, hands trembling with outrage. Just behind him, a tight cluster of male employees, their ID badges hastily removed, were also taken into custody. These were the remnants of the Veyron Circle, the internal shield that had buried complaints and protected predators inside the press chamber. Cameras already flashed, a wall of microphones standing like a tribunal. Darien entered quietly, holding Lior not as a prop, but as a promise. No one spoke. Reporters froze mid-prep, sensing the weight of the moment. The silence was thick, charged. He stepped up to the podium without greeting or preamble. Every man in the room leaned forward, breath held. Darien's voice was even, measured, controlled, but it cut through the air with the authority of consequence. The shutdown of Veyron Air was not a reaction, he began, eyes sweeping across the room. It was a decision waiting for the truth. Murmurs began in the back, quickly silenced by a sharp hand gesture from the moderator. One reporter raised his hand, but Darien continued before the question could form. For years there have been warnings, whispers, data points, reports ignored, misconduct buried, a culture left unchecked, all of it tolerated until this. He reached into his coat pocket and slowly pulled out the blood-stained pen. This, he said, holding it aloft, was used to stab a child. Not accidentally, not in confusion, with intent. My son. Gasps echoed through the hall. A few reporters visibly recoiled. The cameras zoomed in as Darien placed the pen gently on the podium like a piece of evidence in court. This pen wrote 2 stories today, he continued, one of harm and one of accountability. Reporters, now frantic with note-taking, dared not interrupt. Darien glanced down at Lior, whose face rested peacefully against his chest. He won't remember the pain, but all of you will remember what comes next. A man in the second row, gray suit, trembling hands, asked quietly, "Will the airline reopen?" Darien met his eyes. "Only when it's safer than any sky that's ever held a passenger. That's not a promise. That's a condition." He let that hang in the air. Behind him, the Veyron crest loomed, silver and shining, but now tarnished by its association with silence and failure. Foreshadowing wove through his next words as he shifted to a softer tone, one that still held steel underneath. This shutdown wasn't a collapse. It was a reset switch built into the core of the system, one I designed years ago. A safeguard. And, like all safeguards, it waited. It waited for a moment of undeniable failure. He nodded toward the pen. Now that moment has come. The weight of his statement brought a heavy stillness. No one dared breathe too loudly. It was no longer just about a baby and a bad man. It was about a system that rewarded silence, a structure that made cruelty possible. Darien adjusted Lior slightly, brushing his son's head with the side of his face. One last reporter, voice shaking, asked, "Sir, what should the public take from this?" Darien faced the cameras fully, jaw steady, eyes unwavering. "We don't rebuild with policies. We rebuild with truth, the kind that hurts, the kind that forces change." His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper now, but the kind of whisper that carried weight across a nation. We rebuild from truth, not excuses. The encrypted logs were discovered just after sunrise. Darian sat at the head of a long glass-paneled boardroom inside Veyron Air's sealed command hub, the kind of room that once echoed with shareholder forecasts and market strategies. Now, it was a war room for reform. Screens lined the walls, filled with paused footage from various terminals, each capturing old safety violations, cover-ups, and crew misconduct. But none weighed heavier than the paused frame that dominated the center display. Merrick Voss, frozen mid-strike, the sharp pen inches from Lior's neck. The silence in the room was broken only by the hum of the ventilation system and the distant whirring of grounded jets. "Director Crestmore," came a low voice from the doorway. Darian turned. Investigator Jaron Vale stepped inside, holding a secure black folder under one arm, his expression grave. Behind him stood another officer, Raman Kess, a data analyst from the Federal Inquiry Team. "We finished decrypting the last of the logs," Jaron said. "You need to see this." Darian motioned for them to sit, his arms already wrapped around his son Lior, now healed, napped quietly in a sling against his father's chest. The bandage was gone. Replaced by a thin scar and quiet resilience, Jaron placed the folder on the table and opened it with slow precision. "These are communications between Supervisor Taryn Hale and 6 mid-tier executives," he said. "They show coordinated efforts to suppress misconduct cases. But there's more. This wasn't just negligence, it was strategy." Darian didn't flinch. He had suspected as much, but confirmation didn't bring relief. It brought resolve. "Show me the worst," he said quietly. Ramon inserted a drive into the main monitor. Messages filled the screen. Time-stamped threads, encrypted exchanges, internal complaints routed into dead-end directories. One file stood out: OPDISTURBANCE. It contained Merrick's mid-flight call, but it wasn't just a report, it was a signal. A pre-cleared code meant to trigger immunity from upper command. Taryn had authorized it. Darian's jaw tightened. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "They were trying to create instability," he said. "Push me out. Stir chaos within operations to pressure a leadership pivot." Jaron nodded slowly. "They assumed you wouldn't act fast enough. They didn't know what would trigger your response." "They didn't know my son," Darian murmured. He rose from the table, walking to the window that overlooked the empty tarmac. Veyron aircraft stood like monuments, silent, majestic, and grounded in shame. He placed one hand on the glass, his thoughts racing through months of subtle warning signs. Delayed complaints, excused infractions, silenced staff. All of it had pointed toward a brewing insurrection. Now exposed, it was disintegrating. Behind him, the officers waited. Darian turned back. "I want full names, employment histories. I want to know who they promoted, who they protected, and how far this rot has reached." "Yes, sir," Ramon said, already pulling up the internal databases. A chime echoed from Darian's tablet. It was a message from Captain Torrin Vale, now overseeing transition compliance. Terminal 4 petition. 26 former employees requesting reinstatement under the new ethics program. Darian scanned the names. Irony stung. Some had once scoffed at the very safety standards he was now enforcing. They had resisted reform, laughed at protocol revisions, even joked about overreaction. Now they were begging to return. He set the tablet down, turning his gaze to Lior. The boy stirred, his tiny hand gripping the edge of Darian's jacket lapel. "Not yet," Darian whispered to him. "Not until they understand what integrity costs." Later that afternoon, Darian entered the Ethics Design Chamber, a dedicated think tank where he had begun drafting federal proposals aimed beyond Veyron. He stood before a wide digital display marked the Crestmore Integrity System. Its framework lit up like a circuit board, each node a safeguard, each connection a proactive trigger. The new system would monitor crew behavior in real time, flag internal discrepancies, and make it nearly impossible for any misconduct to go unnoticed again. Jalen entered quietly with a fresh briefing packet. "Policy Council's requesting an early draft," he said. "They want to model it nationally." Darian nodded, flipping to the first page. Lior, now awake, squirmed slightly in his sling. "He doesn't cry as much now," Jalen said gently, his eyes on the child. "He's watching," Darian replied. "Learning. Processing." A quiet beat passed. Then Darian clicked the pen, and began writing. The moment felt different than any quarterly strategy or executive decision he'd ever made. There was no applause, no conference call, just a father, a survivor, and an architect of change committing words to paper that might protect others he would never meet. The final twist came near sundown, when Rauman rushed into the chamber with a stunned expression. "We found it," he said breathlessly. "The file that confirms your original suspicion." He handed over a printed transcript. It detailed a strategy memo circulated months ago between Terran and 4 senior-level executives. It outlined how to gradually phase Darian out using manufactured internal failures, culminating in a final stage titled Crisis Catalyst. Merrick's assault had been the perfect opportunity, except it had misfired. "Backfired," Darian said aloud, handing the paper back. "And now it's over." He stepped toward the chamber console and uploaded the full Crestmore integrity system to the Federal Oversight server. As the confirmation screen lit green, Lior reached up, tugging at Darian's tie with a sleepy smile, and in that small, innocent gesture, clutching fabric, not fear, Darian saw the future he was fighting for. He knelt beside the child's carrier and pressed his forehead softly to his son's. "Your pain protected millions," he whispered. "Your pain protected millions." The applause erupts the moment Darian Crestmore steps onto the polished terminal floor, the sound rising like a wave against the high glass walls of the newly reopened Veyron Air Hub. No build-up, no pause. The chapter begins right in the moment the world sees the airline reborn. Darian feels the vibration of the crowd through the soles of his shoes as Lior shifts gently in his arms, the infant's faint breath brushing against his collar. Sunlight pours through the vaulted skylights, striking the silver crest displayed above the entrance, the new emblem of an airline rebuilt not from profit, but from truth. Beneath it, the motto gleams in sharp lettering, "For every passenger, every second." Darian moves toward the stage set at the center of the terminal, flanked by pilots, attendants, safety auditors, and federal partners who worked beside him through the long months of rebuilding. Every step carries weight, not just from responsibility, but from memory. The image of the pen, the cry of his injured son, the stunned faces of passengers watching everything unfold. Though months have passed, the moment still flickers behind his eyes, sharpening his resolve. Lior stirs, and Darian adjusts him, whispering softly, "Almost there," his voice steady despite the swirl of emotion beneath it. As he reaches the podium, murmurs sweep through the crowd. Some recognize him instantly. The quiet man from row 3A, once overlooked, now the reformer whose decisions halted an airline and reshaped an entire industry. Others know him only from the televised hearings, the press conferences, the speeches delivered with calm precision. Dramatic irony lingers in their whispers. Many had once walked past him in terminals without a second glance, unaware they were passing the man who would later change the rules that governed every flight in the sky. To Darian's right stands Ranner Vale, the personnel head who risked his career by exposing Terran Hale's hidden misconduct chain. Ranner's hands tremble slightly as he accepts his appointment letter as the first director of the new ethics division. "I never deserved your trust," he whispers, leaning toward Darian with humbled gratitude. Darian meets his eyes with a calm expression. "You earned it when it mattered," he replies, his voice low but firm. Ranner nods, shoulders straightening. On Darian's left stands Jalen, the attendant who had stepped forward the moment Lior was hurt, breaking his silence even when the truth threatened to destroy his career. Jalen lifts his newly issued safety executive badge with visible awe, his voice cracking as he says, "Thank you for believing I could be more than what I was." Darian places a steady hand on his shoulder. "You became what the airline needed," he answers, sincerity grounding every word. A hush falls as the federal chair steps forward with a ceremonial binder, thick, white, and marked with a bold emblem. The announcement resonates through the terminal speakers. By federal order and unanimous approval, the National Aviation Reform Package shall be known as the Lior Protocol. Gasps ripple through the crowd, followed by another rising swell of applause. Reporters scramble for photos as Darian accepts the binder, the weight of it grounding him in a moment that is both personal and national. He opens the book, revealing clean, untouched pages meant to guide future generations of aviation leaders. The pen he lifts next is the same one Merrick once used, a symbol that had begun as harm but has now been reclaimed. The metal glints as Darian signs the first page slowly, his handwriting steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Each stroke feels like a sealing of past wounds and the marking of a new beginning. Lior lets out a soft sound, reaching upward with small fingers, brushing Darian's chin. The gesture sends a rare warmth through him, a reminder that the heart of this long journey was never revenge or authority. It was a father's instinct to protect, to shield, to repair what had been broken. As the applause crescendos and sunlight spills across the polished floor, Darian lifts Lear higher, letting the child see the bright expanse of the terminal that now represents change. He leans close to his son, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of every step that brought them here, and whispers the final truth that will be remembered not just by him, but by the nation that watched them rise from tragedy to transformation. Justice begins when one small life is treated as priceless. He struck the child and froze as the father calmly removed the pen and signed the airline's shutdown order moments later. If you believe real authority doesn't negotiate with abuse, subscribe now, because justice always lands decisively. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the moment accountability confronts wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, justice, and protecting every family with dignity and respect.